To look at the origins of the tribal class of destroyers of the Royal Navy, you should look to two places: the First World War and the various treaties of the interwar period. As for the First World War, destroyers proved themselves to be an effective offensive weapon, with examples like the Battle of Jutland and numerous other engagements that the Harwich Force found themselves in against German light forces in the North Sea and the English Channel. Not to mention their ability as a defensive screen for the fleet in combat, where they could use their quick firing guns to deter enemy light forces from making an attack run on the rest of the fleet. Now, when it comes to the treaty systems, light cruisers, destroyers were limited in the First London Naval Treaty to 1,500 tons each. However, the signatories were permitted to use 16% of their allocated tonnage for vessels up to 850 tons for a newly defined category of destroyer leader. These vessels would be the leader for each destroyer flotilla. In layman's terms, these ships could be called super destroyers and in some cases light cruisers, which, when it comes to designations for these ships, it depends on who you ask. As I mentioned, some can be called light cruisers and others super destroyers, but let's try not to get bogged down in designations. As I mentioned, the destroyer proved itself to be a very good offensive weapon, primarily with the use of its torpedoes, as well as being a necessity when it came to the defense of the fleet using their guns. Well, the tribal class would be a compromise between these two schools of thought. For this new class of super destroyers, the design would be that of a cruiser shrunken down, meaning that it would cost more than a normal destroyer. But the tribal design would start in 1933, initiated by 3rd Sea Lord and Controller Admiral Sir Charles M. Forbes, who was looking for a new light cruiser design. But the study that was conducted was not exactly supported by everyone in the Royal Navy, notably Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean, Sir William Boyle, 12th Earl of Cork and Auray. He did not like the idea of a general-purpose destroyer, feeling that the size that they were trying to go for would be too small for what in general would be a role fulfilled by a cruiser. There were even proposals for a 4,500-ton design, which would have gotten to cruiser tonnage. When it came to the role of this destroyer leader, the Navy was not necessarily aiming to build up to the limit of the treaties for individual ships. Instead, they planned to build up to the tonnage limit. This was because they were more focused on the role rather than the other navies' comparable ships. The role the tribals were hoped to fill would be something different than other destroyers. For this part, I'll be drawing directly from Tribals, Battles, and Darings, the genesis of the modern destroyer by Dr. Alexander Clark, where he sums up the combat role. Used to supplement cruisers in reconnaissance and screening duties, including screening aircraft carriers, and as support for destroyers in opening the way for a torpedo attack. They may also be used for shadowing at night and to supplement the anti-aircraft fire of battleships. One tribal forming astern of each battleship when air attack is anticipated. The tribals would be viewed as a light cruiser substitute, as well as a force multiplier that could protect Britain's global trade and empire, as having an empire as big as the British did in the 1930s, it was hard finding an adequate amount of ships for far-flung stations like, let's say, the Falklands or places along the west coast of Africa. Now, when it came to combat roles besides anti-aircraft fire support, the tribals were not going to be very helpful for the cruisers in battle, as they would simply be outgunned. Their most useful armament in this capacity would be their torpedoes. However, in a reconnaissance/picket duty role, they'd be able to keep the destroyer flotillas together. Unlike if they were used with the cruisers, their guns would be extremely helpful. When dealing with destroyers and when actually getting into service, the ships would actually take on those command responsibilities of destroyer leaders. Starting in 1936, construction began on the first of two groups of tribals, differing only in armament and crew. The first group would consist of 16, which would be the maximum they could build under the treaty limits. But as the system was unraveling, more tribals were built for the Dominions, 8 for Canada and 3 for Australia. On paper, the displacement was in line with a maximum of 1,850 tons. But as the treaty system dissolved, it ranged anywhere from 1,959 tons to 2,519 tons, depending on the shipyard that built them. They'd be equipped with 3 drum boilers that powered turbines, which drove 2 screws, giving the ship 44,000 shaft horsepower, which made it possible for the ships to reach 36 knots. While their endurance in long sea voyages was better than other destroyers, and was comparable to small cruisers in the Royal Navy like the Dido or Arethusa class. To help fulfill their role as flotilla leaders, which were supposed to give gunfire support, they would be equipped with 8 4.7-inch guns and twin turrets. This class's anti-aircraft battery would consist of a single quadruple 2-pounder or 40mm anti-aircraft gun, along with 2 quadruple half-inch mountings. However, during wartime, this was supplemented by the removal of X turret with a double 4-inch anti-aircraft weapon. The tribals would round out their armament with a quadruple torpedo launcher and about 20 depth charges on a single rack with 2 throwers. As for the names of the destroyers, like the name of the class implies, they are named after native peoples, like Zulu, Tatar, Sikh, Mohawk, and Cossack for the Royal Navy, Iroquois, Huron, Micmac, and Haida for the Royal Canadian Navy, Arunta, Warramunga, and Bataan for the Royal Australian Navy. As for the destroyers of this class, they would come into service just before the Second World War, with the first group commissioning in 1938 and the second batch in 1939. Some would participate in patrols off the Spanish coast whilst the Civil War was still going on. Others doing goodwill visits like HMS Cossack, arguably the most famous ship of the tribal class, who will get its own video at some point. The tribal class would be on the front lines of the war at sea, serving in critical theaters like the Atlantic, North Sea, Mediterranean, Indian Ocean, and Pacific. They would serve their intended purposes for the most part as a reconnaissance force and fleet screen, as well as serving as a very powerful escort vessel for convoys, especially in the Arctic convoys to the Soviet Union, and serving to help shore up far-flung stations. Early on in the war, they would participate in important campaigns like the Norwegian campaign, with the Cossack taking part in what became known as the Altmark incident, along with other destroyers participating in the Second Battle of Narvik. Ships of this class would help to sink the German battleship Bismarck, assist in battles in the Mediterranean, aiding the North African campaign and the invasion of Italy and Sicily, along with other Allied invasions. Like I mentioned previously, they would help to shore up the Pacific Theater in 1945. Now, this video, like some of the other videos on this channel, will serve as an introduction piece to future videos, because I find the tribal class to be an incredibly interesting, quite frankly, a very important design in the history of destroyers. Now, if you guys would, please go take a look at Dr. Alexander Clark's YouTube channel. He posts some really interesting stuff. Also, please go purchase his book. It's really great. I'll try to put both in the description of this video. I'll probably end up making a video near the end of the month, giving what can be akin to the State of the Union address here in the US about the channel. No, it won't be anything bad, just more of me trying to express my thanks for sticking with me through the past 5 months when I started this channel. Anyway, please remember to like and subscribe, as it will help this channel to grow.